We acknowledge that we record this show on the land of the Piramonk people and pay our respects to their elders past and present. G'day comrades, thanks for joining us as we play Minecraft and talk about Kleiner's 2024 article towards a structural turn in consciousness science. Liz, I guess this is the second in what we're calling the main series of episodes. This is the set of episodes where there's probably a fair bit more assumed knowledge than the 101 series. But we will try and explain a key concept along the way in each of our main series episodes. So this is another article, Liz, that I've read and you haven't. Kleiner's making use of and advocating for the use of mathematical spaces in describing conscious experiences. It's something like the quality space approach that we talked about on our last main series episode, and we'll get to an introductory episode for the 101 series in due course. Kleiner's article is called Toward a Structural Turn in Consciousness Science. So to get our head around his argument, we're going to need to know what the structural turn is. Liz, any idea what that means?
Explaining consciousness in terms of the structure of whatever things, neural states, brain states, rather than in terms of their relationships.
I had here a comment to say, no, you're way off. But actually, that's pretty good. Kleiner does mean something quite specific, though, where he says, where verbal descriptions or simple formalizations of conscious experiences are replaced by structural tools, most notably mathematical spaces.
So it's a claim about what we use to explain, like what our theories are going to look like. So just like you don't use words to do quantum physics, you don't use words to do consciousness studies.
Yes, but it's not even like the explanatory part of the theory. It's like the what is there to be explained.
Yeah.
So what's the experimental data that we'll need to explain? Well, that should come out in these more detailed mathematical spaces rather than just vague verbal statements like I saw something or not.
Right. I wasn't sure that he was making the stronger claim.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I think to a quality space theorist like we talked about last time, this will seem pretty minimal. All we need to do to make this turn is to stop using reports like, yes, I see it, as our measures of experience and instead use things like the colour spindle that we talked about last time.
So is it a claim about how to measure consciousness, is what you just said? Is it a claim about what needs to be explained? Is not our verbal reports? Is it both? Are they different?
I think it's saying that the sort of simple verbal reports that are favoured in like masking studies and those sorts of things lack sufficient detail to be a useful explanandum. Explanandum being the thing that needs to be explained.
Yep.
That's the structural turn, right? I think to those of us who are familiar with the quality space work, this isn't a massive claim. We don't need to stress about that. The bulk of Kleiner's argument is about much more substantive issues than just how should we describe the data. And in going through those substantive issues, I'm going to disagree with some of Kleiner's criticisms of Clarke's version of the quality space account. So Austin Clarke wrote Sensory Qualities, which is by far the most important book on consciousness. It's if you're going to read one book on consciousness in your life, that's the one that you read. Kleiner offers some criticisms of that, which I don't think are exactly spot on, but we'll get to all that in a bit. I thought it would be good to start with the point about how consciousness is measured and described, because, Liz, we've talked about this a lot, and we've even drafted papers on this, how theorists like Dennett went wrong initially by having too simple an operationalization of consciousness.
I think I've written a paper with that in the title. I've written a paper in Consciousness and Cognition on how to identify consciousness with neural states, which speaks to operationalization issues. And we've also written an invited review titled How to Operationalize Consciousness, which surveys the landscape. And what was that in, Glenn?
The Australian Journal of Psychology.
Yeah. With lots of other amazing co-authors.
Yes.
I'm really bad at choosing titles which turn up in searches.
Yeah. Anyway, we can use this to spam people with our own stuff.
Yeah. It's a freaking podcast.
Yeah. I quite like the start of Kleiner's piece, even though it's not very long, where the aim is to point out that this sort of approach, the structural approach, should get us a more detailed description of consciousness than you get from studies where subjects just indicate that they can detect a stimulus or not. The structure of the bulk of Kleiner's paper is to look at some good things and some problematic things about this potential structural turn. In particular, they give us 3 good things or promises of this approach and raise 3 problems. So let's have a look at those in turn. The first promising aspect of the structural turn is closely related to the point about measurement that we opened up with. A lot of theories of consciousness are designed to explain consciousness in the sense of subjects being able to detect a stimulus. So a masking study would be the kind of typical scenario that we're talking about here. So say a word is presented on a screen followed by a mask, for example, just like 4 capital X's. Depending on the time the word appears on the screen before the mask, subjects might report seeing it or not. Most theories of consciousness, Kleiner contends, are focused on the difference between when subjects say they see the word and when they say they don't see it. Most research in this area is, of course, focused on when subjects say they don't see the word, but it still affects their behaviour in some way.
So, yes, I think the interesting thing about masking is that you can mask a word and it can still influence your behaviour. Like you might be more, if you see the word house rather than dog, you might be more likely to choose a picture of a house. So the point is to home in on what awareness does and doesn't influence. So were you aware of it? Could you tell me about it? Yes. Then there's these things you can do and there's these things you can't do.
Yeah, so another way to think of it, just a different phrasing of the same sort of thing that you're saying there, Liz, is that we approach consciousness by understanding the difference between conscious and unconscious information processing.
Sure. So
it's very much in that sort of tradition. So that's why these sorts of studies are the driving force behind things like the multiple drafts theory of consciousness and global workspace theory of consciousness. We'll introduce both of those in the 101 series in the coming weeks for those who don't know. But for now, they're 2 dominant theories of consciousness that are very much derived from this sort of experimental work. So Kleiner contends that of the 39 theories of consciousness, I have a note there that says pause for laughter. Thanks for actually laughing at that.
That seems very fine-grained to me in a way that could get in the way of making some interesting generalizations.
Of the 39 theories of consciousness that Kleiner has identified, generally what these do is try to identify some property of the mental representation of the word that the subject sees on the screen that is present in the case when subjects say they see it, but not present in the case when they say they don't. That feature then is hypothesized to be or to explain consciousness. So higher order thought theories work like this, right? So the word is seen when there's a higher order thought about the visual representation of the word and not seen when there isn't that higher order thought about the visual representation of the word. Structural approaches, in contrast, provide much more information about conscious experience. It's not simply the experience is present or not, but rather the experiences are described in terms of relations between one experience and another. For example, how similar are experiences in the case of quality spaces?
What would a structural account of consciousness have to say about the simple masking? Does it even take that as an explanander?
I don't think that it does.
Right.
I think the reasons for that are quite complicated, and, read my book, sort of things. But I think that structural approaches do end up distinguishing between explanations of consciousness in the sense of sensory qualities or phenomenal qualities and explanations of consciousness as awareness.
So I guess the key point here is stop to think about what somebody's trying to explain so you don't end up talking past each other.
This distinction might be worth us spending a little bit of time introducing, Liz.
So I would say that there is two things that jump out about consciousness, and that the word is ambiguous, at least in what it refers to. On the one hand, there is what it is like, and on the other hand, there is for the subject. So, what is the difference between something looking red and something looking blue? And what is the difference between being aware that I'm looking at something red and not being aware that I'm looking at something red?
So these are run together for those who have listened to the first in our 101 series by Nagel. And it's only in more recent work where this distinction starts to be drawn. We're obviously going to talk about that more in coming weeks, especially in the 101 series. But those who are interested in this might look up the distinction between awareness and phenomenal qualities, or Block talks about this in slightly different terms. He talks about consciousness as phenomenology, so appearances, or as access, which is what we've been calling awareness.
The key thing to keep in mind now is that some people take the phenomenon that they're trying to explain to be what it is likeness, and other people start by trying to explain awareness, and whether an explanation of one is an explanation of the other. In other words, whether those two things can come apart varies depending on what theory you have.
I wanted to try and give an example that might help as well.
Awesome.
So it's in one case, if we're trying to explain awareness, we're trying to explain the difference between the case where you can say you see the word before the mask and the case when you say that you can't see the word before the mask. In the other case, where we're trying to explain phenomenal qualities, we'd be trying to explain the difference between the word before the mask looking red and the word before the mask looking blue.
Whether or not you can tell me about whether it occurred.
Yes.
Don't care whether you noticed it or not. What's the difference between it looking red and it looking blue?
Kleiner likes these structural approaches which describe experiences in terms of their relations to one another, because they think that they provide more information about consciousness and therefore how theories should be constrained. So the hope is that there is more empirically to decide between theories when we have better data. So we can move on to the second promise of the structural approach. The idea here is that theories that make use of these better descriptions of consciousness should make more varied and precise predictions about what subjects will experience in experiments. So in the long run, we can expect better experimental tests of theories of consciousness. The third and final of the three promises that Kleiner lists is that a new understanding of consciousness can help us tackle some of the conflicts in our intuitive or theoretical understanding of consciousness. So we talked about this on the show before, Liz, and many other times as well. We have an understanding of what consciousness is just in virtue of being humans embedded in a culture. Various analytic philosophers have come up with scenarios, intuition pumps really, that make use of the fact that this understanding is pre-theoretical and use that to try and force theoretical conclusions. Kleiner points out structural approaches will have something to say about those intuitions and those intuition pumps. So pre-theoretically, a lot of people have the intuition that our colour experiences could be different than they are. After all, we can create a doctored photo or just paint a picture where grass is red and the sky is yellow. So why couldn't someone be seeing real green grass as what I call red, for example, or the real blue sky as what I call yellow? Some people also have the intuition from this, and this is sometimes called the inverted spectrum intuition, that it would be possible to switch or invert all our colour experiences in this way, but in such a way that it would be undetectable. Now, this is supposed to create problems for the idea that consciousness can be explained and leads to some weird metaphysics. We don't need to worry about that. But as Kleiner points out, the assumption or intuition pushing this is that there could be undetectable differences in experience. And this depends on there being a perfectly symmetrical on all dimensions colour space, right?
So this is a very old argument so far.
In fact, colour space isn't symmetrical, it's asymmetrical on several dimensions.
So if you inverted it, along those dimensions you'd be able to check it. If people were seeing the sky as yellow and sunflowers as blue, they would be saying that sunflowers are darker than the sky. Did I get that all right?
They'd be saying that the sunflowers look darker than other people say they look.
Yes.
Yep. And that the sky looks lighter than other people say it does. So the promise here is, as you say, Liz, it's quite an old one, that these sorts of approaches tell us when there is something wrong with the intuitions that we just happen to have about consciousness in virtue of having consciousness and living in a particular cultural context. In this case, the intuition that there could be a human with all of their colour experiences inverted, which is undetectable, is just wrong. So far, so good. I think we're on board with a lot of that. The remainder of Kleiner's argument is going to be more novel and focuses on what they consider to be some limitations of these kinds of approaches. Though calling them limitations is perhaps a bit pessimistic. What Kleiner says is this is a quote, key questions that the structural research will have to tackle, end quote. That doesn't really mean the approach is limited, right? Just unfinished.
Yeah.
They are going to make some specific suggestions, and some of these are interesting. There's one or two which I think are unhelpful, which is worth talking about as well. Mm-hmm. One thing which he says that I don't think is very helpful is just that the first potential limitation is that structural approaches seem to assume some sort of materialism about consciousness, right? To which my reaction is just, so fucking what?
But also no. No, they don't have to. That just says that the relationships, that you can map the relationships, but I don't think that... I think I can imagine a dualist saying, sure, you can map the relationships.
Yes.
I don't see why that follows.
One of the arguments against dualism is that it's so under-constrained that it can accommodate anything. Of course it could accommodate this as well with, ad hoc adjustment So I didn't find that claim was very helpful, but rather than skip over this section completely, it's worth spending a bit of time here because they make a distinction between what they call structural and structuralist approaches to consciousness. So we're going to be playing some definition games for a while. Applied to consciousness studies, a structuralist approach is one which claims that any experience or phenomenal quality has a unique location within an experience or quality space. There is some mathematics in this, which we're going to skip over. But if we take a simple example like the color spindle, a particular shade of lime, for example, has a location on that spindle which it and only it occupies. Because of this uniqueness of location, if we define all the structural facts about that particular shade of lime, its relations to all other points in the spindle, we have specified that particular shade of lime and nothing else needs to be added.
I have tended to think about the sort of position I find correct as saying that what makes it that particular shade of lime green is its relationship to other things. Is that a similar position? Is it that it's in that space and that if you change the space, you change it?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And if that's difficult for people to follow who are unfamiliar with this approach, in not the next 101 episode, but the one after that will be about this in more detail.
So that is what Clark says?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Pretty much exactly Clark. These structuralist approaches are going to be contrasted to structural approaches. So just drop the ist. These, in contrast, apply a mathematical structure to describe experience, but this structure isn't taken to be sufficient to define particular experiences. Such a structure has two parts. A domain being the points in the space, e.g. points representing particular hues in the colour space, and functions or relations. Function here is being used in the mathematical sense, not the cognitive science or biological sense. So a function here is a mapping of one domain onto another. So this is like a function in the sense of an equation. A consequence of this is that a function uses real numbers to represent points in a space, and relations are relations between points in that space. To get our heads around this, Kleiner gives us an example of less than or equals as such a relation. Why not use particular distances between points? Well, for Kleiner, and this is where, the math starts to get a bit harder and my explanation of it might not be sufficient, but the distances between points there for Kleiner are another domain, so they fall into the same category of things as how we label the points. But one point where I did get confused was that I thought from Kleiner's definition of the structuralist view that the structuralists would just need locations and distances between qualities to define them, which I think is what I said before. But now when they're talking about the structural view, they say, this is a quote, "When we use the term structure in the context of structuralist ideas, however, it only refers to the second ingredient of a mathematical structure, the functions and relations that a mathematical structure contains." So that's the thing about it just being relations. These functions or relations are what individuates the individuals, the elements in the structuralist sense. End quote.
Is this a view they pin on people? So they say X, Y, and Z have a structuralist view.
I think that they're saying that there are some which are closer to the structuralist view and some which are closer to the structural view.
And so the structural view says says distance matters.
The absolute number matters. The actual numbers that you use to describe the points which represent each phenomenal quality matter. For in the structural sense, in the structuralist sense, it's only the distances between the points that matter.
So I'm going to say now that I suspect that, because this is what I think, that a lot of structuralists that a lot of structuralists haven't thought carefully enough about it for it to be fair to say they believe that the absolute value of the distance doesn't matter.
Yeah. What is fair, though, is that, in fact, some of the statistical techniques that you use to derive these spaces don't assign absolute values that matter.
I'm sure they don't.
Yeah. So that's still fair, even if that's not something that individual researchers would say that's going to be the final answer. But how it's currently done does make that the case.
Yeah, but is that maths easier?
That maths is doable.
Whereas the maths that you would need if the absolute value matters is much harder?
You wouldn't even know where to start with what we can currently measure.
Why wouldn't you start with the relations and then work out the absolute value later?
Because of what you were saying before about the list of relations can exist between two isomorphic spaces with different absolute values.
I had assumed that if the absolute value matters, then just giving the relative value is a poor approximation, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah, and look, when I say that you wouldn't know where to start, I'm talking about doing this from a behavioural point of view. If you
Sorry, Creeper! It was all about Minecraft and not at all about...
Yep.
Well,
yeah.
I guess so from a behavioural point of view, why wouldn't you start by mapping the relations and then inflating or deflating them and seeing if that makes a difference?
Yeah, and so where the absolute value would matter and where it could be assigned is if we were ever able to get to the point where we can measure the activity of individual neurons in a meaningful way and assign them, specific firing rates and so on.
I'm watching zombies destroy each other.
Yeah,
That's
so
perfect.
this would be like how, connectionist networks get analysed. If we're ever able to do that for the real brain, then we'd be able to get more of this sort of structural approach. What we just talked about might not make a lot of sense to a lot of people. That was a fairly technical digression. Where Klein is coming from is they're going to offer criticism of the structuralist approach in that they say it doesn't make sense to have a structure in the sense of just relations without a domain. So there needs to be, as I understand this claim, there needs to be points which are in the relationships as well as the relationships themselves.
If you really want to be a materialist and say that these are states, as in things, then there has to be things that are related.
Right. So then the challenge is going to be to people like Clark, who say that the relations are sufficient to define the phenomenal quality.
Does he... I mean, the relations are sufficient. Yeah, I don't think that.
Yeah, so...
I think what it's made of matters.
Yeah, so that's a very O'Brien and Opie sort of view, that the actual quality is intrinsic to the pattern of activity which is the explicit representing vehicle.
Does Clark not think that?
No, Clark is very explicit that
it's
green is just those sets of relations and nothing else.
Okay, I don't agree with Clark.
But
which is fine.
Yeah. Well, which is fine to do. It's fine to disagree with Clark, but I would say there that there is a caveat that that's from the point of view of describing these things based on behavioral data and people's experiences, and that there's an alternative approach to describing them in terms of neural activation patterns. And I think you can be Clark in the sense of, say, from the behavioral point of view, all we have is the relations, but then from the neural point of view, we have particular patterns of activity which are in those relations.
So this is where...
So I don't think the distinction is as clear as Kleiner would like it to be.
The point of my consciousness and cognition paper is to not let instrumentalism slip into your theory of consciousness, and maybe what's going on here is an unkind instrumentalist reading of Clark, as in failing to distinguish between the thing you're explaining and how you can measure, failing to distinguish between the thing that you're explaining and how you measure it.
And what are potentially two different ways of measuring the same thing,
yes.
Behaviorally or neurally,
yep.
Or depending on your theory, you might prefer how the thing that we measure behaviorally is implemented neurally. And
yep.
If that's the sort of view that you liked, you might think that the implementation is where you get a structural view, and the structuralist view is sufficient for describing the behavioural data.
I just wince when it says what all we need to explain is the behavioural data, because that just goes against my deeply ingrained cognitivist upbringing in psychology.
Sure, but the point that I made can be rephrased as you describe the behavioural data in this structuralist way, whereas the ultimate neural explanation should be structural in Kleiner's sense, and they might not end up being completely different, especially if you think that the quality space or whatever other sort of spatial description you end up with of experience is just a description of the data, not the explanation. So where I said explain before, that probably was too strong, and it should have just been described.
Okay, sure. So Clark is trying to give us a description of the data that covers everything about it.
Yeah.
I mean, data can't be sufficient, but exhaustive.
Yeah, so
Clark's trying to give us, saying that you want to know what green is? Here's an exhaustive description of it.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, right. Okay, well, that's different from saying that's what green is.
Yeah, from explaining why that quality space holds. I think...
Why is that description exhaustive is a different question from...
Yeah,
Here is an exhaustive description.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that we will talk about in 101 in not the next episode, but the one after.
Okay. I've never thought about it like that before, so that'll be fun.
We already have notes on that ready to go. But yes, there is a sort of ambiguity being sort of traded on here as to what the nature of the material basis of the quality space is, and whether you sort of overreach metaphysically from the description of the quality space as such, without considering neural implementation. But that's sort of a different question and requires a different argument in Clark. I'm not even sure because I've running together Gardenfor's book and Clark's in my head, so I'm not sure if neural implementation is even talked about in quality spaces now. I'll need to check. So Kleiner's there, like, he's trying to make the maths work.
Sure, and you know, if it's a real thing as opposed to just a mathematical abstraction,
yeah.
then the absolute value is going to matter.
Yeah,
I don't know. That's my feel. That's my gut response.
Yeah, and certainly it is possible at this stage to distinguish between identity theorists who would think something like the quality space is actually implemented in a neural activation space and so it is identical to it, and others, perhaps functionalists who don't like that approach, saying that it's the quality space is just an abstract way of describing lots of experiences together, but that's not implemented as such by the brain. Those are possible positions, which ultimately need to be distinguished between. Alright, I do want to now just skip over a little bit of Kleiner's argument because they go back to the issue of dualism. But, you know, what comes next is quite interesting. Again, I think it's a bit pessimistic on Kleiner's part to use the label limitation here rather than see this as just part of the project. That's a merely linguistic point. I just don't want to be saying that we have to be committed to thinking that this can't be solved or anything. So once we have structures like color space, taste space, etc., that describe experiences in detail, we want to explain that structure. And Liz, we've already been going around this point a little bit so far. One hypothesis that's floating around is the idea that there is a structure-preserving mapping between quality spaces and neural activation spaces. So a neural activation space is just a way of describing activity in a neural network. So we describe numerically the activity of each neuron in the network, say that at the rate it's firing, and plot that on a graph. With each dimension of the graph corresponding to a particular neuron. The activity of the network then corresponds to a point on that graph. And that's very quick, but the point is there is a way to describe the activity of a neural network that uses points in a space. Now, what would it mean to hypothesize that there's some sort of structure-preserving mapping between a quality space and a neural activation space? Well, the first point would be that points in one correspond to points in the other. For example, a shade of lime has a corresponding neural activation, a shade of red has a different corresponding neural activation, etc. Second, that the relations between the points in one space have a corresponding relations in the other. But, for example, the activations corresponding to two shades of red will be closer together than either is to the activation corresponding to that lime green. Alright. Lots of questions as to exactly how that might work. Are the mappings exactly one-to-one? Which neural activation space are we talking about? Is it the whole brain, part of it? If it's part, which part, etc., etc. All of that can and does define different research projects to see if that hypothesis can be made to work. Kleiner criticizes this approach on the grounds that the assumption of a structure-preserving mapping between a quality and a neural activation spaces hasn't been justified. So there's a lot there that I've gone over there very quickly. So it's worth picking out the issues that Kleiner raises one by one, so we can try and get our heads around exactly what the criticism is here. So, first point. Structure-preserving mappings assume the existence of both structures, so one can't explain the other.
What?
Yep, because the idea of a structure-preserving relationship between quality space and a neural activation space assumes both the spaces. We can't explain quality space in terms of this structure-preserving relation. What do we think of that?
I probably agree it's not sufficient.
So I think it's worth asking exactly what notion of explanation is at play here for Kleiner, right? So a clue comes from this quote, which is taken from Anil Seth's 2021 notion of the real problem of consciousness. I just want to ask as an aside there, is that perhaps a familiar term, one that we might have come across, say, 2 years before Seth was using it?
I've forgotten. Who said it?
You haven't read my book?
Oh, sorry. No, I haven't.
You have a signed copy just over there.
I was aware that you used that phrase. Was not aware of the timing.
Anyway, I'm being a knob, but...
No, I'm feeling like a really bad partner. Freaking read your freaking book. I read bits of it.
Read the bits that were used in the publications afterwards. Anyway, so we're trying to get our head around the what notion of explanation is at play when we're trying to explain quality spaces in terms of structure-preserving mappings between them and activation spaces. So Kleiner says, this is a quote, "But if a homomorphism presupposes structures on both ends, it doesn't explain, predict, or allow to control these structures." End quote. So that suggests to me that the kind of explanation here that Kleiner's interested in is a causal explanation, because the terms used there are explain, predict, or allow control. So if that's the only kind of explanation that's allowed, it seems to be ruling out by fiat identity as a kind of explanation. Indeed, Kleiner lists 5 forms of explanation, and all of them are causal or correlational. None of them allow for identity as a kind of explanation.
Really?
So, yeah.
I think a very natural reading of the claim that these structures matter because it enables an identity.
I think that Kleiner's quite right to say that you can't have like a causal or a control kind of explanation between spaces like this, but that we should still allow an identity type explanation to be on the table. Identity just meaning that they're the same thing described in a different way.
It just seems so obvious to me that it supports an identity that I'm finding... Oh,
yep, but we were both raised at the University of Jack Smart and UT Place, and not everyone else was, and philosophy is very driven by traditions and not necessarily by exposure to the same argument.
Yes, that's fascinating.
All right, so there's another challenge here. A couple more to go. Going back to Kleiner and another challenge. Because of their mathematics, they claim structure-preserving mappings don't map from structure to structure, but rather just from point to point. They preserve or respect relations between points in virtue of picking out the points, but they don't actually represent the relations. What do we think of that?
All right, so this is the balloon point. Yeah, sure. I don't know why it matters. Because I'm an identity theorist and I don't think that the structural preserving mappings are sufficient. I think there's more to explain or something.
Yeah, so...
I'm sort of like, why do I care?
Yeah, that's where I ended up as well. Okay. Is I think we'd agree there is a question as to why neural activation spaces have the structures they do.
It would be wow, what a coincidence that they have the same structure.
Yeah.
Like, seriously.
Yeah, right. So, and I think we'd perhaps lean towards a different kind of explanation here, something the connectionists might like in terms of, connection weights between different layers of the network.
Oh, what?
I don't want to go into that in great detail. But we should talk about that at some point. That would be more than a whole show on its own. It seems like we would favour there being a neural explanation of why neural activation spaces have the structure they do.
Well, and I also think that there's a representational explanation as well. Why does the brain have neural structures with that structure rather than a different one? And I think it's something to do with navigating the world with the photoreceptors we have.
Yeah, excellent. And then we're going to get into
it
questions about whether like a connection weight explanation and a representational analysis relationship actually amount to the same thing, or whether they're distinct levels of description and so on. So you can see how you end up down a very big rabbit hole here pretty quickly.
Explain is just so underspecified.
Yeah. I don't think either of those two concerns that we talked about so far have the force that Kleiner thinks, at least not without showing there's something wrong with treating identity as an explanation. The next round of objections that we'll go through, and we've got just two more to go through, and these are going to focus on particular proposals about how to measure quality spaces rather than this general point about the relations between activation space and quality space. Using multidimensional scaling, which we mentioned last time, and I hinted at earlier in the show, to allow us to use numbers to represent distances between points is unjustified.
What?
So this...
because it's an actual number.
Because it's an actual number, yeah. But I do think that this sits in tension a bit with some of the points that Kleiner was making. Yeah. And that's not necessarily a problem with the paper as such. If it's trying to say, here are some unsolved issues, it's fine for unsolved issues to be in tension with each other.
We shouldn't take the number literally.
It's
a tool, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't, in multidimensional scaling, you can't take the position, the number describing the position literally. I think there is a justification for using multidimensional scaling, and that is that it provides a way to represent relative similarity. Yeah. That's the relations between the point. And that's why I think Clark, and Kleiner is specifically targeting Clark here, we get an argument that we should use multi-dimensional scaling. So in Sensory Qualities, the book, there is an argument we should use multi-dimensional scaling because it does allow us to precisely describe relationships between points. I disagree with Kleiner here that multi-dimensional scaling is just used out of convenience. I think it's actually used because the alternative, which is just listing things without describing the relationships, doesn't give you enough power to describe or even represent relative similarity, which is what you get by having their distances between points. Ordered lists just give you an order. They don't tell you how far apart the points are.
It's like hamstringing the position.
Yeah, it is.
What's the problem with multidimensional scaling for Kleiner?
The objection, as I understand it, is that multidimensional scaling assigns particular numbers to distances between points, and that there isn't an argument for that. But I think there actually is an argument for that in Clark that Kleiner just doesn't make use of.
What's wrong with assigning numbers to things in order to do maths to describe it?
Yeah, I think Kleiner's not saying it's false. He's saying that if it's going to turn out that this is a good tool, there should be a reason for using that tool.
Is he criticising the mathematical tool or its application to this particular phenomenon?
As I read it, he was saying we could just use ordered lists between stimulus rather than assigning them distances, and we'd need some reason to think that assigning them distances is better or preferable. And that reason, I think it does appear in Clark's original book, which is just that then distance can be used to represent relative similarity rather than just order. I think because Kleiner doesn't make use of that argument in Clark, he sort of end up going, I don't see what the argument for this is, just because he's sort of missed that. I want to just move on to the last objection that Kleiner raises. Again, calling this an objection is a bit strong. It's just a bit unfinished. So multidimensional scaling means that we represent not just the points that we have acquired in the experiment, but also an infinity of points between those. Because the space is now continuous, we also have an infinity of points which are numerically distinct from, say, a point representing a particular shade of red or lime, but which the subjects can't distinguish.
Yeah, that's because there's a difference between the space and your awareness and reporting of the space. Problem solved.
Perhaps it's also perhaps possible that we use regions of space rather than actual points in them. I also think here we're just getting a bit Xeno with the distances, right? To the first part of that, the first infinity, I think the strength of multidimensional scaling is that it can represent stimuli other than those used in the study. Again, Austin Clark's being criticised in particular here, but in my memory of Clark, and again, this could be from Garden Force because I've run them together in my mind, there's quite a lot of work on how regions in quality spaces are defined, which we need to do because we need to be able to describe how shades of blue can all be distinguished as, you know, separate points or small regions, yet are all treated as blue as a larger region. This dividing the space into regions is really important for understanding how experiences work and how quality spaces work, and Kleiner's not really engaged with that there, so I don't think he's shown that there is an issue with these infinities because they can be divided.
Yeah.
I think we can end there. Kleiner does say a bit more about issues of topology and the dependence of the shape of quality space on the particular experimental stimuli used. Mm-hmm. This, I think, is used to motivate their alternative methodology, which is only briefly described in the paper. It's originally from a slightly older paper written with Ludwig. So I think we should save discussion of that methodology until we read that. With that, let's call it a day. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everyone.